I wanted to just give a brief overview of who we are and what we do and why it works, so that way you understand the little tips and tricks that I'm going to be sharing with you. It's just helpful to have a little background on that. So art therapists are master level clinicians. We typically have a credential from the Art Therapy Credentials Board, and the state of Connecticut finally granted us our own licensure, which is great. We finally have title protection in the state. So formerly we were all LPCs, and some of us are going to keep that credential and add a certified licensed art therapist. So if you see those popping around, that's the newer credential for us. But we work with people of all ages across a broad spectrum of practice. We're guided by ethical standards, and our education and supervised training prepares us for culturally proficient work with diverse populations in a variety of settings. So you see us in schools, hospitals, psychiatric and rehabilitation facilities, forensic institutions, veterans clinics, community centers. We are popping up everywhere, but we honor the individual's values and beliefs, and art therapists work with people who are challenged with medical and mental health problems, as well as individuals seeking emotional, creative, and spiritual growth. Okay, so what is art therapy exactly? It's an integrative health and human services profession, and we work with individuals, families, and communities. And our work involves art making, the creative process, and applied psychological theory. And this all happens within the psychotherapeutic relationship. So what can art therapy do? It can improve cognitive and sensory motor functioning. It fosters self-esteem and self-awareness, which we know are very, very important. We can help cultivate emotional resilience, which we will circle back to at the end of this presentation. But we help promote insight, enhance social skills, especially within the group setting. We can help reduce and resolve conflict and distress. And we also advance societal change. So you'll often see some art therapists hosting art shows. I just hosted my first art show, which was very exciting. Although we were affected by the pandemic, but it was virtual, but it was great nonetheless. So how art therapy works. So we're kind of talking about the brain here, but you'll hear a lot of art therapists talk about how we work bilaterally. And working bilaterally is just great for assimilating new information. It's just a different way of thinking, feeling, and doing, but art helps promote that. So through integrative methods, art therapy engages the mind, the body, and the spirit in ways that are distinct from verbal articulation alone. Its kinesthetic, sensory, perceptual, and symbolic opportunities invite alternate modes of receptive and expressive communication, which can circumvent the limitations of language. So this is especially applicable with trauma. We know that trauma is stored iconically. So sometimes we call it flashbulb memory, where we just have almost like a freeze frame of like the event, okay? And oftentimes you'll hear people say, I don't have the words to describe it. So art can access those memories and the way that they're stored, because we can express it through image. Okay, so a lot of people ask me, what happens in session? Do I have to be good at art? No, the answer is no. If you're open to sitting down with some materials, then it's always there for you. It's not an art lesson. It's not anything that gets graded. The structure really depends on the goals. So if someone is working towards independence and just free expression, you'll probably see a less directive or structured approach and more of like an open studio kind of approach. But especially for kids who really thrive off of structure, the sessions that I hold are typically more structured. They have more direction. A directive is a specific art task that I ask of the client. So like I said, it's not an art lesson. Sometimes there's open-ended art making, which is really art as therapy as opposed to art in therapy. And when I say processing, I mean we're talking about the artwork and we're just being curious about it. It's processing rather than interpretation. Okay, so I figured I would just throw out some example directives just so you can get an idea of how I translate art and use it within a session. I've had people make anxiety creatures, so I'll ask them, if your anxiety were a creature, what would it look like? And it's really just to get them curious about what their anxiety might look like. I've also done that with trauma, depression. I work a lot with grief, so I'll have my clients do grief landscapes or process paintings, which is when they're painting on the same canvas over an extended period of time, so over weeks. And we document the transformation of that. Constructions, deconstructions, and reconstructions. So I have a lot of clients who like to channel some anger through some deconstructions in a safe way. So they'll make something and then destroy it and then piece it back together. And what they're doing really is making meaning out of something. Body mapping, timelines and maps, book, doll, and mask making, active imagination dialogue, healthy regressions, altered books, and symbolic self-portraits are also some of my favorites. So tying this into what we're dealing with right now, in general, I want to talk about the stress response. What's happening is our limbic system, in response to prolonged exposure to stress, is more activated. Our limbic system is primarily responsible for fight or flight mode. So when we sense threats or just exposure to prolonged amounts of stress, that part of our brain becomes more active, and to compensate, our prefrontal cortex kind of decreases activity. So when that happens, our prefrontal cortex is responsible for like juggling complex tasks, time management, focusing, completing tasks. That is kind of temporarily, the activity is kind of temporarily decreasing, okay? So a lot of people are saying that they just aren't motivated to follow through with tasks, they're tired, they're distracted. This is a real thing. We need to consider this in terms of what we're going through. So we are dealing with that on top of processing collective grief, which Dawnmarie talked about. So what do we do, okay? This is one of my favorite ways to talk about using art to kind of process what we're experiencing. Oftentimes you'll hear externalizing in a negative light, like through behavior, acting out. Externalizing with art is coping mindfully by accessing alternate forms of expression within the here and now. So instead of focusing on the what if, we can focus on the what is. So how do we do that? So I figured I would just put like a quick example in here, and you guys can try this, in your own time. But you take a deep breath, you feel your feet on the floor, and instead of describing the feeling with words, I want to challenge you to describe it as best you can using color. Okay, so grab a piece of paper and just try and describe what you're feeling with a color. And then to take it a step further, if you want to, you can challenge yourself to use shape, line, and form to kind of better describe what it is you're experiencing. So what's the value in this? It's inherently validating. It provides some emotional distance. So what happens is when we choose colors to describe how we feel, or line, or shape, or form, we then become the observer of our thoughts and feelings rather than being that feeling, okay? So emotional distance in that respect can be very valuable and important. When we maintain that observer perspective, we can become curious rather than fearful, which is something that I teach a lot of my clients. Like, can we be curious about this instead of scared or fearful? And this can lead us to thinking and feeling and doing differently. And this moves us into dialectics rather than polarizing thought patterns. So dialectics really considers that you can feel more than one way about something, even if they're seemingly opposite feelings. And that is just a more peaceful way of living. It's less black and white. And this generates compassion for ourselves. And when we can generate compassion for ourselves, we can then extend that to others, which is something that we could all really use right now, right? So that's about that. But I just wanted to end with this quote. I hope and memory have one daughter, and her name is Art. So, questions? That's a picture of my necklace.